Welcome to the Irish Pagan School podcast. Your hosts are authors and co-founders of the Irish Pagan School here in County Waterford, Ireland, Laura O'Brien and John O'Sullivan. Fáilte. Gordy. Hello, this is Laura O'Brien from the Irish Pagan School, and I'm here yet again with Dr. Gillian Kenny. And we are doing a whole playlist of these Q&A sessions with Dr. Kenny, who is a teacher at the Irish Pagan School, has many, many wonderful, wonderful courses with us. So definitely go and check out the link below to get more of this, what did you call it? Endless rambling bullshit, which is absolutely amazing.
Which I spent a long time at college for.
Exactly. So let's get into it. Today we are going to talk about witch hunting. So witch hunting in Ireland presents a really complex narrative. It definitely didn't flow the same way as it did in the rest of Europe to a certain extent. But could you contrast how Ireland's witch hunts differed from elsewhere in Europe and perhaps give us a teaser about how this was explored in your course?
Yeah, sure. So people are aware of the Great Witch Trials, which kind of took place for a lot of Europe in people's minds from about the 16th and 17th centuries. But the origins of them are actually older. The belief in witches is obviously a very old one. You can trace it right back into ancient civilizations. And when it came to the Irish kind of situation and how they dealt with the growing kind of chorus about linking witchcraft with kind of demonology from about the 14th century on, Ireland is really a very, very interesting counter to much of what happened in the rest of Europe. So basically, Ireland didn't have witch hunts. I mean, that's the simplest way of putting it. There's complex reasons for it. Some of them are socio-cultural. Ireland was, from the 14th century onwards, slightly earlier, split between areas of Anglo-Irish influence, influenced by English law and custom, and Gaelic Irish influence. But by the 14th century and onwards, the Gaelic influence is really quite strong across the country. So in terms of witchcraft belief, the Irish didn't ever develop or hold on to that belief that witches were in league with the devil, which came from that kind of clerical elite on continental Europe. The Irish view of dealings with the supernatural didn't really veer from dealings with the she. So the she were the principal kind of messengers to the supernatural or links for Irish people. And that idea of a witch who had dealings with the supernatural never intruded on the kind of worldview. So in a sense, they're kind of insulated because the folk beliefs were so strong and because the intermediaries amongst the human population were so protected. So things like the wise women, it didn't evolve. The Irish worldview, I guess, can be summed up with the supernatural in the Middle Ages and even into the early modern period as you're dealing with people, and there's a way of dealing with them which has worked, or with entities which has worked for possibly thousands of years. Don't change it. And that seems to have been hardwired into the Irish psyche. So these outside forces didn't really penetrate. I mean, partly because the Irish church didn't adhere to these witchcraft beliefs. It's heavily Gaelicized. So it kind of forms a different branch to mainline Western Catholicism. So you don't get that. You don't get that push. But in Anglo-Irish areas, there is some kind of go at pushing the witchcraft beliefs in the early 14th century. So I guess there's a major witchcraft trial of a woman called Alice Kettler in the 1320s, and that is interesting. That's interesting because not a lot of people know this, but that's the first witchcraft trial, the first big proper one, where lots of the later kind of beliefs were first tried out. So the idea that you have kind of dealings with the devil in the form of a being, like in her case, a black man, the idea that, you'd use all kinds of horrible sacrifices and the idea of having sex with the devil and stuff like that to gain. So that's kind of trialed out in Alice's trial. Interestingly, she escaped. She was a member of a powerful Anglo-Irish family, but her maidservant was burned. So, but that was it, really. It didn't take off, partly because the Anglo-Irish bishop or the English bishop who pushed it was so hated by the Anglo-Irish elite around him that they hounded him out
Mm.
after it, and they
He
wouldn't
actually
have any
ended up
truck with it.
accused of heresy as well, didn't he? In a
Yeah.
turn of events.
Yeah, I mean that's the way it was. It's a really fascinating period, that early 14th century. I mean, within the Catholic Church, it's absolutely bizarre if people want to read. I mean, the fear amongst the kind of clerical elites on the continent, particularly in the papal court, around demonology, the use of ritual magic was off the scale. So there was a widespread kind of fascination with and fear of magic and magical interactions with supernatural beings. And of course, because it's a patriarchal system, the part of the fear came from keeping that knowledge from women. So
Mm,
it's kept to a male clerical elite, particularly the ritual magic. So he comes from that system,
mm,
and then he tries to bring in to Ireland this idea, and it just didn't catch on. And it's probably because the country was so fractured in one part culturally, also as well, this Irish inbuilt kind of thing about interactions with the she being the principal means to keep yourself safe and to keep them appeased.
mm,
And the people who had interactions with them, your community representatives, were never tainted with that witchcraft kind of thing. So later on, post kind of mid 16th century, when you start to get the plantations and the kind of genocidal tactics, which are kind of wiping out large amounts of the Irish population
mm,
and planting in English and Scottish settlers, you do start to get some of those witchcraft beliefs. There are some trials, but the number of actual deaths is extremely low. It's
mm,
like from what we can see, it's like less than 10
mm,
in those kind of couple of centuries. So it's very slow. The impact of Gaelicization, even on succeeding settlers, is really strong. I mean, in the course I teach you in that class, I mean, I do talk about, you do get English writers, this kind of conflict between English writers who come into Ireland in the 16th, 17th centuries, and they come up against
mm,
these folk beliefs
mm,
and they talk about them. And I guess that leads me on to kind of what's one of the selling points of the course is, well, the most dangerous witch the Irish believed in, because they did have the idea of a witch.
mm,
She was a shapeshifter, was the butter witch,
mm.
who wouldn't affect humans but would kind of steal your dairy.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
because
Turning into a
dairy
hare and
turned into
milking,
a hare,
taking your milk for your cows, and
yeah,
you wouldn't be able to churn your
they'd
butter.
suckle
And
them. Yeah.
yeah,
So it's that, and it's about, that was a fear the Irish had. And of course, that's linked to subsistence lifestyle and the
mm,
importance of dairy to the diet. So there's these stories in later times of like old women being found with a gunshot,
mm,
on her because someone had shot at her as a
mm,
hare. But that was kind of it. I mean,
mm.
that was kind of it in terms of the low
Yeah,
level kind of
yeah.
magic surrounding you. That was kind of it. There was no kind of belief in witches flying about at night or murdering babies or making candles from baby fat or having deals with the devil, the third nipple. None of
None of
that
that.
stuff.
No, no.
None of that stuff
And
came in
even
and
the
permeated.
butter witch or the Kylioch or the hare, any of that kind of, it's all a little bit tangled as well with the idea that maybe this woman is actually a banshee, a woman of the she. So maybe she's not quite
Yeah,
human anyway, and she could just
yeah,
be living as an old woman. And then, the stealing of babies and everything, we have a lot on that from the changeling side of things. So again, you have this interweaving of the other world and even like the supernatural with ghosts and with gods. And, you wouldn't know what would
yeah,
be coming out of the she mounds. It's not just fairies as we'd think of them now. And it was just so like present, really,
yeah.
and it still is in a lot of ways, and to a lot of people, myself included. The other world is still very present here on the island, and it's just it stretches back as far as we can see, really, doesn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so I think it can be I think it can be difficult for many people nowadays to without viewing it as superstition, to appreciate just how present the idea of a world that lived alongside you was. But I think it is something that kind of lived in, I mean, Irish people got up and they went to work and they did the lands.
Yeah.
And, they didn't all run around going, oh no, the fairies are going to take us away. But it's there.
Mm.
It just sits there.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just this idea that in terms of like your day-to-day rituals, you'd leave out something for the fairies.
They get
You'd
the
make
first of
sure
everything,
they
particularly.
get the first. Yeah, when you built something, you would make sure that it didn't cross over a fairy pathway. You were just aware the land itself was peopled with people you couldn't always see, but they're there. So I think that recognition, I mean, it's not superstition. It is a very different worldview. And what was coming in from mainstream Catholicism from the 14th century really onwards quite strongly, it just didn't come in. It just didn't bite. Part of it, of course, is because it was being kind of propagated by what were seen as foreign English
the oppressors.
bishops. So that's not going to come in. That's not going to be adopted. So that's part of it. But also, I think for many Irish people, Gaelic Irish and people in Anglo-Irish areas, because that kind of social Gaelicization was really quite strong. The system worked. If you did have trouble with your cattle, you could go down to Mr. or Mrs. X down the road and say, what's going on? And they'd say, give me a minute. And then they'd come back to you and go, you need to do X because you pissed off the sheep. Okay. And you know what? It seemed to be a system that was working in terms of social cohesion and a place for people who had maybe that link to the other world, or that bent within them that meant they could facilitate that. There was a space for those people who didn't fit into maybe any other box.
Yeah.
So it's about that, isn't it? It's about it just didn't come in. Now, it also, interestingly, it didn't really impede a lot, especially in the early period, into places like Wales as well, which also has had a strong she belief, strong different kind of indigenous beliefs. Scotland's another matter. In the Highlands, not so much in the early days, but Lowlands, which was heavily populated by English speaking, quite an extensive kind of witch hunting kind of agenda. But yeah, Ireland is to a certain extent pretty anomalous when you talk about Western nations and witch hunting.
Well, that is fascinating, and it really ties in with what we teach at the Irish Pagan School, that what we're presenting as contemporary paganism is still very tapped into these living traditions, and that's how we frame it, that's how we phrase it, because that's how we as Irish people understand it, that it is, yes, it's our history, yes, it's our mythology, yes, it's our folklore, but it is such a part of our culture and such a part of our lived experience to this day. I mean, when we moved into this house, the side gate kept opening, anomalously. We couldn't figure out why. And my kids, who will absolutely swear up and down blind that they have nothing to do with mom's weird shit, right? But they were like, is it on a fairy path? We need to set up the stack of stones and see if they get knocked over. So I went out and I set up the stack of stones, and they did not get knocked over, and the gate stopped closing. So now I also upped my boundary protections. It was a new house, so I just made sure that everything was up to scratch. And my kids settled, and there was no problem, And that's just my most recent example. But there's so much of it that is just still a part of our living traditions, of our culture, of our lived experience here. And it gives me a lot of comfort, I have to say, knowing that we can look back through history and we're still doing the same things that, generations of ancestors, whether they're blood ancestors or not, they're Irish ancestors generally, So thanks for that, Gillian. Make sure that you check out the playlist. We have many of these fascinating discussions which talk about classes that Gillian teaches at the school. So this one is Witch Hunting in Ireland. And there is a link below to all of Gillian's classes, so definitely check them out because they're absolutely fascinating. And again, they really give us the cultural context for, what could be just disassociated neo-pagan practices, but actually have a root and have a bed here in the living traditions of Ireland. So thanks, Gillian, and we'll see you in the next video. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a positive review in your podcast listener. Then head over to irishpaganschool.com and enroll in one of our free or paid courses. Slán go fóill, and we will see you next time.